I'm joined today by Tim Mousseau, professor of biological sciences at the University of South Carolina. Tim, you've been researching the sort of longer term impacts of radioactive contaminants. You've looked at populations of birds, you've looked at insects, you've also looked at people. What is your sense of what is most noticeably missing from sort of the average layman's understanding of the impact of radioactive contaminants?
Yeah, so right at this point in time, clearly there's this impression that's being transmitted by the popular media, the Disney Channel kind of thing, that maybe the plants and animals are thriving inside the Chernobyl zone because of the absence of hunting. There's a fence around the zone, and not many people are allowed in. And so what's being presented as this highly radioactive area is being sort of a wildlife refuge, an Eden for wildlife, and that's clearly not the case when you actually do the science and go count the animals.
And what's your sense of sort of the changes that can take place in populations over longer periods of time when exposed to radioactive contaminants? I think it's sort of much more commonly discussed acute radiation poisoning, etc. But over time, what changes can we see in human and animal populations?
No, that's a really good point, and that really kind of defines the difference between toxicology, which is really what a lot of the radiation studies have been in the past, and radioecology or ecological studies or evolutionary studies, that which is what we're trying to do. It's very clear that when organisms are living in their natural environment, exposed to the wide range of other kinds of stressors that wild organisms have to face, things are very different. And this is particularly true when these organisms are faced with exposure to these contaminants generation after generation after generation. The effects of mutations, the direct effects of the radiation and the other contaminants in the area contribute together, work together to lead to dramatically larger impacts on these natural populations than sort of traditional toxicological studies would predict.
What does the current science tell us about the sort of sensitivity or susceptibility of different species to these types of elements? I mean, is the sense that all species on Earth are sort of equally impacted? Do we see differences? What species maybe are more resistant or less impacted?
Yeah, very good question. And it's very, very clear that there's a huge variability in the susceptibility or vulnerability of different species to these contaminants, but as well as, individuals within the same species show tremendous variation in their vulnerability. Some of this is because of, differences in diet. Some organisms tend to eat food that's on the ground where the highest levels of contamination is found. Some organisms like to eat mushrooms, for instance, and mushrooms are well known to concentrate radioactive cesium, and thus these organisms are getting a bigger dose. One of the things that we've observed by comparing our studies of Fukushima and Chernobyl is that the birds and the butterflies appear to be particularly vulnerable to the effects of contamination. We think this is because they share a kind of a unique genetic system for determining sex that makes the females particularly vulnerable, and this generates reduced population growth rates. But yeah, it's very clear that there's tremendous variation in sensitivity. We just published a paper last month, actually, that investigated all of the studies we could find for Chernobyl, where they looked at antioxidant levels in these organisms that are living there. They also looked at genetic damage or some proxy for genetic damage, as well as oxidative stress coming in from the radiation. And it was very clear that there were trade-offs in the consequences or trade-offs in the use of antioxidants to defend against the consequences of ionizing radiation. And that we think, based on many of our other studies, this seems to play a major role in determining the vulnerability of individuals and different species.
So when we think about the animal kingdom, so to speak, Is there
Mhm.
any general rule we can apply to sort of give us a sense of how this works? So, for example, as a general thing, we know that larger species tend to live longer than smaller species of animal, but within each species, the smaller individual animals tend to live longer than the larger. So elephants live longer than flies, but small elephants live longer than large elephants. Is there some sort of broader rule that you could tell us about here on this?
Yeah, I'm not sure that rule applies universally. I don't think it applies to, for instance, insects, where there's usually a very good relationship between the age of the organism or how long it takes to reach sexual maturity and its size,
Mm.
unless the organism is unhealthy. And usually for most organisms, there's an optimal body size, that reflects long-term evolutionary selection for that particular size in a given environment. So again, I'm not sure if there's a general rule of thumb that applies in that circumstance.
Fair enough. So some of the work you do is not without controversy, and I'm sure there's no doubt in my mind you're aware of this. But there are those you have critics who say that your work is really sort of a veil for an anti-nuclear energy sentiment, right? And it's a pretty clear and sort of easy to understand allegation, which is the work you're doing is really just a way to dissuade from the use of nuclear power. How do you
Mm.
respond to such an allegation?
Yeah, it's this comes simply from the fact that our findings tend to uncover never before seen consequences of this kind of stress, this radioactive stress. Yeah, I'm not an anti-nuclear activist. That's certainly not how I got into this business. I started and I continue to be an evolutionary ecologist or evolutionary geneticist. My interest is in how organisms adapt to changing environments. I used to work primarily on changes in seasonality, or what we might call climate change at this point, looking at the genetic basis of adaptation, looking at the genetic basis of behavior. Actually, when we first started our work in Chernobyl 16 years ago, we went there looking for the sorts of adaptations that plants and animals might employ to adjust to this kind of environment. We were actually thinking that there might be many kinds of adaptations. We'd read some of the literature coming out of the International Atomic Energy Agency and related panels, suggesting that the plants and animals were thriving, and the only way to kind of reconcile that observation with the known effects of radiation is that they must be adapting. And we've we've been looking very hard for adaptation in a wide variety of different organisms. We found some hints that some species may be adjusting their life cycle or adjusting their use of different antioxidants again, in a way that allows them to survive better and reproduce better than they otherwise might be able to in the presence of radiation. But yeah, certainly our motivations are not at all related to any kind of anti-nuclear activism. In fact, I got into science because my best friend's father was a nuclear physicist at Los Alamos, and I thought at one time I might want to go down that path myself. Again, it's true that the activist community has taken a great interest in our work, but we would be equally thrilled if the nuclear regulatory community also was interested in our work.
So,
In
so to
fact,
be
that
clear, just as one example, when you spoke at Physicians for Social Responsibility, that's a group that was founded by Helen Caldicott, who has said Chernobyl killed 1 million people. I've not been able to find what I would consider a sort of serious peer-reviewed study that says that. Even though you spoke there, you don't necessarily agree with every claim that individuals involved with that might make.
Absolutely correct. A number of years ago, I had to make a decision about who I would respond to, who I would speak to.
Yeah.
And I decided that, the only way I could do this as a scientist was to accept all invitations to speak. If somebody wants to know about the work we're doing, I have an obligation as a science and as a scientist and as a communicator to speak to them. And so as long as somebody's willing to pay my airfare to get to the meeting, I'm quite happy to speak to any group as long as it fits my schedule.
And I think that a lot of scientists we've interviewed sort of share that view. And I've asked them this, and I'm curious, do you have any uh, sort of way to protect yourself, or is it even your responsibility, or do you care to protect your research from being used in ways that may be deceptive or misleading? I mean, as you say, you show up and speak and you say what you want, but what is your sort of reaction or concern with others misusing your research?
Yeah, so again, the only way we can deal with this, the only way that we can, as scientists, really behave responsibly is to publish our science in the scientific literature, making use of the peer review process, and to limit, for the most part, what we say to the work that has been through that process. That's sort of the minimum expectation for contribution to the discussion. It has to be peer-reviewed scientific literature, and so this is what we focused on doing, conducting the research, but also publishing it as best we can, and making use of that as our starting point for the discussion. What we hope to do is to provide the data, the information for evidence-based science policy. Again, no matter what you think about nuclear energy, it's here with us to stay for a long time to come. And we have to deal with the issues, the environmental issues, the policy issues related to that technology, one way or another. I live here in South Carolina, and we have 4 new reactors being built as I speak within a stone's throw of where I live. And so we need to have the best available information. What's clear to me is that there has been some attempt, either just passively or perhaps not so passively, to ignore some of the environmental consequences of nuclear accidents, and other related activities. And I think if we're going to be continuing to use this type of energy, we need to have the answers to the environmental consequences.
All right, we've been speaking with Tim Mousseau, professor of biological sciences at the University of South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining me today.
A pleasure. Thanks for calling.